Dominic, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to have this conversation with you at this time as you're embarking on the inaugural systemic investing event. But it's also a time that's quite special for Canada, and we're here in a moment in time where the $755 million social finance fund is rolling out through intermediaries across the country. Climate philanthropy and the climate philanthropy movement is growing in Canada, and so much more. So first off, congratulations on imagining, developing, and hosting the Systemic Investing Summit. I really wish I could be there in person, perhaps if you do this again. Before we get started on our conversation, which I think will be quite enlightening, I first want to acknowledge today that I'm speaking from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in what is colonially known as Ottawa, Canada. As a settler to this land and a first-generation immigrant, my parents moved to this country when I was about 9 years old from India. Territorial acknowledgement is important for me to locate myself and be present to the privileges I have as a first-generation settler. Dominic, as Executive Director of Transcap Initiative, what an incredible opportunity to play a role in stewarding the field and practice of systemic investing and taking it help take it to the next level. The potential certainly seems enormous. The urgency is very clear. Our learning, unlearning, and investment approaches have to keep pace with the multifaceted, complex, and dynamic nature of planetary and societal transition. So this is a really, really exciting. And Peter, you're a program director at the Builders Initiative, where you're leading environmental grant-making, impact investing, and strategic partnerships for the Builders Initiative's Ocean Initiative. I'm really intrigued by your work. I had a quick peek at the types of things that you're working on and how you're putting systemic investing into practice. I'm sure we'll hear all about that. So I'd like to have an open, honest, nuanced conversation about the potential, about the practices, as well as the blind spots to date that you folks have identified and will be grappling with and navigating when it comes to systemic investing, because it is a new area, it's an emerging area. So let's dive in. Dominic, I'll start with you. You've spoken about this and you've written about a systemic investment logic. Tell us, what is this logic in simple language, as well as what is systemic investing?
Thank you, Vinod, and thanks for having us here. We use the word logic maybe for the lack of a better alternative, but it goes to what you said at the beginning about having to unlearn the practice of finance and relearn it. Because the point about systemic investing is that it's not just an incremental improvement of traditional impact investing approaches. It's really a more fundamental rethink of the deployment of capital in service of solving societal challenges. So let me make that a little bit more tangible. In traditional impact investing, the typical starting point is usually a pot of money, say a venture capital fund, a social investment fund, or a foundation. And that pot of money comes with a particular set of interests and constraints and usually a particular governance structure. And then it goes out to look for interesting, promising propositions, fundable propositions that meet whatever intent that capital has.
Right.
In systemic investing, our starting point is different. The starting point is always a human system, a city, a coastal zone, a forest, a landscape. And then we ask, what's the vision for that system? How could that system get there, get to that future point? And what's the role of capital in enabling that transition? So you sort of work backwards from the interests and needs of the system and try to figure out the role of capital in it. And because you're looking at the human system, you're sort of inevitably starting to adopt the system's lens for making sense of the problem and for how to address it. So you call into service the mindsets, the tools, the methods of systems work, and start applying those at almost every stage of the investment process. And what results from that is still investing, but it looks and feels very different from traditional investing. And so systemic investing, simply speaking, is just what emerges at that sort of intersection between systems thinking and finance practice. And there's no clear definition of it yet, let alone a precise methodology. Nor will there ever be, because it wouldn't be very systemic to say, we have a panacea for solving complex societal issues.
Right. And, Peter, I want to turn it to you now. Dominic's mentioned a few examples, cities, etc. From a practice perspective, what have you discovered are the limitations of traditional financing?
Well, I think we have within Builders Initiative and Builders Vision, which is sort of our parent company, we have a variety of different financial units within the office, all with different objectives. So we have a foundation that does philanthropy, pure philanthropy. We've got an impact investment team. We've got a venture investing team and an asset management team, and they all are driven by seeking to drive systemic change in the way that they define it. And yet they're all built off of different financial structures. And I'll just use our venture investment team as an example. Their primary objective is to seek market rate return opportunities. Well, when that is the sole thing that you're seeking, it's limiting in terms of the way that you can look at the entirety of the system and be able to support work at a systemic level. And what we found within both our philanthropic work and our impact investment work is, as we've brought those together, we're able to sort of put capital to work where different types or forms of capital are needed in order to solve the societal or global challenges that we need. And that means grant dollars to help provide research and development for early stage technologies. It means grant dollars for policy work to enable the opportunity for scalable solutions, and then investment dollars in spaces where we can actually accelerate and scale solutions. And so I think the limitations are the way that you institutionally look at it. And if you put constraints, be they financial or impact or otherwise, around how different parts of a business can function, you're then limiting the ability to sort of take that holistic view that Dominic's referring to in terms of systemic investing.
Right. And, Dominic, you mentioned that there's no definition yet. Like, how much of a problem is that? Like, not having a definition right now. Do you see any risks with that? Could there be potentially a fragmentation of multiple definitions depending on the kinds of things people are looking to work on, or the geographies that they're working in?
I don't necessarily see it as a risk, and as a matter of fact, the fragmentation is happening, and there are variations of systemic investing being talked about and practiced, sometimes under different names: system level investing, systems change investing, transformative investing, etc. I think that's not a bug. That's a feature of systems innovation work per se. You need to have, you need to run these experiments and see what does actually work. Now, we have a working hypothesis of what a definition could look like for the particular flavor of all things money and systems that we work on. But I do think that there is something powerful, socially powerful, in having a definition insofar as it bounds the field. And as a result of that, enables a sense of belonging. And as a result of that, that's a prerequisite for creating a community of practice. So sense of, definition, boundary, sense of belonging, community of practice, which then gives you a critical mass to scale it as a practice beyond its initial niche.
Right. And that, journey makes a lot of sense. One of the, I have a follow-up question for you, Peter, but just very quickly. One of the things that I've seen happen, and you both, I'm sure, have seen this as well, where there sometimes can be this tension between human-centered thinking, human-centered design thinking, and systems thinking. And often the critique is that when there are people who are incredibly focused in on human-centered design, ethnographers and those types of folks, you're sort of over dialing or you can over dial on human-centered design, losing sight of the system. And the inverse is also true. If you're a systems thinker, sometimes it's incredibly difficult to really get into what is the human experience and the human history and the anthropological journey that this experience has. So, what is the way in which systemic investing tries to balance the two? Because there can be this toggle, and there has been this tension, at least in some fields in Canada, where design thinking and systems thinking have kind of been at odds in some ways. So what is the balance that you could strike here? Because you've mentioned human systems, but and I'm curious for Dominic, for you to go a bit deeper on that.
So I'll speak to the conceptual, and then Peter may be able to tell us how he does it in practice. So one of the fundamental principles of working with complexity is to be comfortable with polarity, right? And I think you just mentioned apolarity. And whether you lean toward one pole or another depends a lot on the context. Where this question particularly becomes relevant, for instance, is in systems mapping. There is a branch of the systems world, complex system science, system dynamics, for instance, that put a lot of stock in the models that they produce, the modeling that they do, the quantitative outputs, the statistical relationships that they model. And then there is a branch of systems work that's much more, anthropological, kind of takes a more human-centric approach to it, and maybe sees systems mapping, the value of systems mapping in the process rather than the output itself. And I think both poles can be powerful depending on what system you're in. If you're in an energy system that's probably more complicated than complex, and where the market is designed to the nth degree and heavily influenced by policies, you can probably do a lot of interesting modeling to figure out relationships, feedback loops, leverage points, etc. In a really messy human system, say the food system, for instance, that becomes trickier because of the sheer complexity of it. So it is contextual, and all systems in some ways are unique.
Right. Peter, what's your take?
I mean, I think, I guess the way that I would answer that is that when we set out to build our program strategy around oceans, and that was thinking both about philanthropic capital and impact investment work, we went through a systems mapping exercise. And so we very much sort of looked at this in trying to understand the system that we were trying to influence versus actually thinking about human-centered design as we embarked on that journey. But I will say that even in the context of building our program, we've always felt like our oceans work isn't about solely ocean conservation or ocean health, because the resource user is as important in designing something that will work as the resource itself. And so while I don't believe that we sort of academically or theoretically really used human-centered design in the way that we were thinking of developing our programming, but leaned more on the side of system, it was with an ear or an eye towards trying to understand how people engage in these systems. And I think one of the challenges that we found with our work is that we're actually kind of looking back on the way that you first sort of started this conversation. We're working at both the global scale in terms of trying to influence capital flows for oceans, and in some contexts or in some ways, we're working at very hyper-localized scales. And I think the human-centered design becomes much more important at some level in those local contexts where you've got influxes of ideas and information and ecosystem interactions that go far beyond sort of the topic that you're dealing with. And so if I just use oceans as an example, you could start to think about the need for engaging much more actively in poverty eradication or food security or coastal development issues. And when you get rooted in place, it's easier to understand how these things sort of expand and cycle as you look at the system. When you're working at the global level, it's a lot easier to be super sector specific.
Right. Yeah. Well, take us into your oceans work a little bit. Paint us the vision for that system, and give us a. I'm sure there's some early activity and promise there. So just take us into your work a bit.
Well, just sort of building off of what I just said. I mean, I think there's a natural, maybe using Dominic's term, polarity in the fact that we're trying to, at some level, achieve both of sort of the global transformational nature of influencing capital flows in oceans and the hyper local. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of that. So when we built the impact investment platform, the initial concept was really with an eye towards life below water is the least resourced sustainable development goal. It has historically been subject to a lot of philanthropy, but less than most other sectors. And it has largely been ignored by the investment community for anything other than full resource extraction, like overfishing, pulling oil and gas out of the ocean, and other sorts of things. And so as we sought to develop a economic future built on blue economy sustainability, the ideal was how do we drive as much capital into this underfunded sector as possible? And so we're investing in first-time funds with fund managers that have a focus for their investment thesis in oceans. We're helping the accelerator ecosystem develop by providing through these different accelerator and incubator programs the business development skills that are necessary for companies to begin to establish and scale and take root and build. And we're supporting really innovative entrepreneurs and thinkers that are creating what we hope will be the companies of the future that are based off of this importance of healthy ocean and blue economy businesses. At a hyper-local scale, we're trying to do that in certain places that are important to builders. And so I'll use the state of Maine as an example. Right. There, we're pushing for seaweed and oyster businesses to develop in the coastal zone that will provide jobs for people that no longer can rely on cod or lobster, as cod disappears completely because of overfishing and lobster starts to move into Atlantic Canada. And we need to begin to understand the future of the coastal economy and how we continue to utilize that resource in a meaningful way. And additionally, trying to help with the technology innovations that will help people do this work better and more sustainably, and then to put capital to work in ways that allow for these companies to scale. So low interest loans, investing in funds that will contribute to the startup economy. And so it's sort of taking that global vision of mobilize a lot of capital into oceans and then bringing it to roost in a particular place. Right.
Well, I'm Atlantic Canadian and I'd be very upset if cod disappeared again. Just to say, I want to perhaps, Dominic, ask a slightly provocative question. Does systemic investing make social finance obsolete?
I mean, I'm in no position to answer that question. So let me say, first of all, systemic investing, at the heart of systemic investing is a hypothesis around impact. It's sort of a hypothesis around the promise of having a better chance at greater impact or better impact. And I'm calling it a hypothesis because I don't want us to be seen trying to be selling a truth, when really, at the moment, systemic investing is a coherent collection of really compelling ideas that are steeped in about a decade of collective experience doing systems change work. I mean, not exhaustively, but the kind of experience we have access to, that points very compellingly to a number of structural failures of traditional impact capital, and also to a set of ideas and mindsets and approaches that you might want to call into service as you address systems challenges. And everything else needs to be demonstrated and proven, right? Which actually then sort of leads us to one of the biggest challenges for the development of the field. In a lot of cases, it will be very difficult to deliver the proof of systems change within a reasonable time frame, right? So it's one thing to say, you're running a clean tech venture fund and you're making a set of bets on clean tech technologies where you can do some sort of life cycle analysis and some sort of scale-up modeling to estimate, number of tons of CO2 saved.
Right.
It's a very different thing to then point to, say, a city or a coastal zone or an agricultural supply chain and say, we have actually succeeded at changing the structures and the dynamics of that system in a fundamental, irreversible way. Now, that's not to say, that's not an argument against systemic investing. It's just the points to the difficulty of proving the hypothesis. But the arguments, the theoretical and conceptual arguments for why you want to bring some of these principles to bear in practice are sound and compelling. So, I think it's landing this, or trying to land this, is that it will serve us as a field well to bring a level of humility to the work and and be clear about what we can stand behind theoretically and practically, and what is yet to be demonstrated.
Right. So let me put the question a different way. What, in your mind, is the relationship between social finance, impact investing, and systemic investing?
So help me understand how you make sense of social investing or social finance. What is your definition?
So I'll give you sort of a sense. And one of the reasons I'm curious about this is the social finance movement and landscape is growing, very fast in Canada and frankly around the world. You just have to sort of look at the last sort of decade or so and look ahead to the sort of the next decade. It's growing a fair bit, particularly in the global south. And there's lots of accelerators, venture funds, doing a range of different types of capital deployment. And all the sort of the traditional, conventional sort of stuff, from your convertible notes to equity-based things, to a whole range of other types of blended philanthropy, type approaches. And that space is growing a fair bit. There isn't the sort of the same approach or mindset, if you will, in that the questions around what is the vision for the system aren't the sort of the higher order questions, right? It's really about this venture has a particular tool technology, to deploy something that could then, right? So what is the relationship between that movement and this growing community of practice, or what can be the relationship?
Okay, so let me pick up on one thing you said to just highlight a really definitional contrast there. The kind of social finance or impact investing that you just mentioned tends to revolve around individual propositions. Individual social enterprises, individual projects, individual companies or technologies. And it's around that single asset that you make sense of the proposition's impact potential, but also financial return prospects. Systemic investing rejects the notion that systems change can be the result of a single intervention, and embraces this idea that it's much more likely for a system to change if a multitude of things within a system happen with a degree of strategic coherence. And so as a result of that, you wouldn't look to the single asset for your impact. You would look to the portfolio of things to drive your impact, right? So your unit of analysis moves from the individual asset to the strategic portfolio at large. And it's at the portfolio level where you start to make sense of, impact potential and try and maximize that, but also start to manage for systemic risk and for financial risk. And the ramifications of that can be quite profound, because it may make sense to include something in a portfolio through a portfolio lens that wouldn't make sense if you apply the single asset lens. So if you picture an energy system, for instance, that transitions from fossil fuel baseload power to renewable but intermittent power, you may need a fast ramping generator in that system to help with smoothing out the intermittency of renewables. So it could make a lot of sense for that system to have a gas-fired power plant in the mix. But if you take a single asset lens, that gas-fired power plant would never pass your environmental footprinting test. If you take the system lens, all of a sudden this makes sense. And so, I think this idea that you got to let go of this idea that you transact. I mean, ultimately you do transact at the individual level, but it's not where you try and make sense of what you're actually doing and where you're trying to steer both impact and finance. So there's sort of almost a definitional contrast between those two portfolio composition paradigms. You're actually you're looking for positive correlation. You're looking for amplification effects within your portfolio, as opposed to, say, risk reduction through diversification, which is the dominant portfolio composition. So Builder's Vision, for instance, or maybe, I'll let you, Peter, talk about that, but, talk about the range of things in your portfolio and how they all are sort of, strategically related to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power or the benefit of what we've been able to do is best illustrated through the examples of sort of sitting side by side and having the same objective, our philanthropic work and our impact investment work. And I'll use an example that sort of illustrates that. If we've invested in fund investments that are first-time aquaculture funds supporting businesses that are growing seaweed or fish or mussels or clams and trying to feed the world. And they invest in a company in Iceland, and they invest in a company in Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. And their window is sustainable production of food. Full stop. That's what their goal is. And that's a admirable objective, but it is sort of singular in what they're trying to accomplish and to achieve an investment of capital that will make money and drive the growth of those businesses.
Okay. So we're doing some work with a large private equity firm, and they've told us a story that they've made an investment in a company producing electric vehicles. And that's a company that has a great technology, great vehicles. But that asset now is at risk of getting stranded because the demand isn't there to scale it up, because there's no charging infrastructure.
Right.
So nobody's building the charging infrastructure, and so that reduces demand on their product. And even if somebody were to build the charging infrastructure, there would still be a question of, is there enough power in the system? So is there a distribution grid and transmission grid, and is there generation capacity in the first place, which would be one of the bottlenecks here in this country, in Switzerland? So if you take a single asset lens, all you do is you look at the manufacturer of that electric vehicle and say, oh, this is great. And if if we deploy 10,000 units that displace 10,000 diesel buses, we run the LCA, here's our impact, right? But then it doesn't scale because systemically, the system's not ready. And you're not necessarily seeing that because you're not thinking about the ecosystem in that way. And if you did that, maybe you'd concluded that not only would you need to do a growth equity investment in that EV vehicle, but also make sure, either you build the infrastructure yourself through an infrastructure tranche, or you make sure somebody else does, or even the upstream generation capacity.
Just getting back to it, I mean, I think when you look at the objectives on our philanthropic side around trying to ensure coastal community livelihood benefits associated with food production, climate benefits associated with healthy coastal ecosystems, you begin to invest in ways that are looking beyond just that sort of earlier example of a sustainable company that is doing something good and providing food, but you're looking at those additional benefits and how they play out. And so one of the things that we're beginning to do is look at how do we look at investing in aquaculture companies that are producing seaweed or mussels in ways that improve the health of coastal ecosystems and are actually conferring benefits to coastal communities in addition to the profitability of the company itself. And if you're only looking through a sector lens of investing with particular financial goals, then you won't be able to see sort of that broader remit associated with sort of the systemic change that we're talking about today.
Right, and let's take that a step further there, Peter, because I am curious. Dominic's mentioned sort of units of analysis and so on. Impact measurement is a big subject. Has been for some time. Picked up steam again. There's now this emerging language, that sort of mainstream, particularly around verified impact. Right, and so from your perspective, given the work that you're doing and within your portfolio, what are a couple of indicators of positive outcomes when it comes to systemic investing? What are you looking for?
I mean, I guess the best way I would answer that is that we are looking at a variety of indicators of success that don't just look at essentially one sector. And so the worst way to frame this in some ways is in the context of ESG, because it's tossed around so frequently. But the reality is that when we go into looking at our programming and how we're putting capital to work, we are looking at a variety of environmental indicators, economic indicators, and social indicators. And so as we go to invest, we're looking at the contribution that a company is making to improvements in ocean's health and improvements in the water, the state of the planet. We're looking at jobs. We're looking at the viability of businesses being set up and how those businesses provide meaningful jobs to people. And we're looking at the ways that these businesses are contributing to the economy. And so I guess maybe the better way of saying it is we're trying to take ESG and put it a little bit on an accelerated path for real impact. It's not just about broad ESG, but trying to tie a particular investment to clear objectives that have social impacts, that have environmental impacts, and have economic impacts for good.
Right. I mean, ESG is, there's going through so much critique right now, and has been for a little bit of time. There's a whole, and you're familiar with this, I'm sure, Peter. There's a whole anti-ESG, movement. But is there any sense of greenwashing, social washing type, things happening or emerging in this systemic?
Yeah. So let me just.
There is. Okay.
Talk to systemic impact, and then I'll take this first. So,
yeah,
I think there is so systemic investing creates the need to rethink how we conceptualize impact, to rethink the metrics we use to measure that impact, and then how we interpret the results of it. And if we, I think what we're interested in when looking at societal issue through the systems lens is the dynamics of a system, the structure of a system, the feedback loops embedded in it, which are often, you would say, speak more to the root causes of societal issues, or are, instead of a causal chain logic, more upstream. And so an example of that would be, again, in the mobility space. If you are a sustainable mobility investor, you could either look at some sort of crude end of the chain metric like CO2 saved, or you can start studying cultural shifts, like how do people think about transportation? How many young people get their driver's license? What happens to the consumption of mobility at large? Do people consume more mobility, less mobility? What happens to parking spaces in cities? Are they growing? Are they reducing? So you kind of look in different places to get a feel for how is a social norm changing, or how is an incentive structure changing within a system? And will you ever be able to verify that quantitatively? Maybe. So, you can look at the number of driver's licenses handed out, but what's the point of getting something verified that's fundamentally the wrong metric to look at? Right. And even if you have that, what does the number actually tell you? And there's a growing body of literature around the problem of correspondence or non-correspondence. So this difference between what people think a metric tells them and what's really happening on the ground. So I think we've maneuvered ourselves into a little bit of a tricky situation there, because obviously, depending on where the money comes from, you need to be held accountable for what you do with it. So there is a need to demonstrate some impact in some way, but it's really not all that helpful that we're now seeing, a demand for quantifiable metrics, for verified metrics. That just means that you're going to allocate the money to where things are measurable, but not necessarily where it's most needed.
Right. Yeah. Peter, your thoughts on this? And I've got one final question to wrap up.
100% agree with Dominic. I mean, I think one of the things that we struggle with, and again, we're experiencing this firsthand in terms of even just thinking about the way our office operates, is so much of the investment world has always relied on numbers and quantifiable metrics to define success. And we know, both from grant making and philanthropy and systemic investing, that there's a whole qualitative piece to measuring success that is hugely relevant and important to how a system evolves and changes over time. And that is harder to track, but no less important to think about and consider as we evaluate the success of programming. And so I can't stress enough that, what Dominic said about, verified things and quantifiable numbers only tell part of the story.
Right. That's terrific, and it's a really good critique on that. A final question for you both. I'd like to talk about dreams a little bit. And so, imagine we're 10 years out from now, so it's the year 2034. What are your dreams for the field of systemic investing? Give us one big dream. First, maybe we'll start off with you, Peter, and then Dominic.
Sure. I mean, I think my dreams aren't so much for the field of systemic investing, but the field of oceans sustainability and ocean health. And and I think largely that's because I've devoted the entirety of my career to trying to transform those sectors. We are mobilizing capital at an astounding rate compared to where we were even 5 years ago, and yet it is a fraction of what is needed in order to truly drive the changes required for climate and food security for the next 20 to 30 years. And I think the ocean is a very critical contributor to both climate and food security. And so when you say, wow, we've got, $2.5 billion of money flowing into investing in oceans, that is nowhere near where it needs to be. And so if in 2034, I was able to say we were, mobilizing upwards of $100 million or $1 billion annually into driving the systemic changes we needed in our sector to meet climate security and food security challenges. I'd feel very happy.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Dominic?
In 2007, a group of pioneers of the social finance space got together in Bellagio in Italy at the invite of the Rockefeller Foundation and thought about how to advance the field of sustainable finance. And they ended up coining the term impact investing. And as a result of that, sparked an entirely new financial industry, financial paradigm. We think that that's been extremely valuable in laying the foundation of how we need to think about deployment of capital, but that it's also now clear that there's some structural limitations with some of these traditional approaches, and that there's a need to move to that next generation, its next incarnation. And the dream would be that systemic investing is that new frontier, becomes that new paradigm. And by that, I mean the strategic deployment of multiple forms of capital from multiple sources under a shared theory of systems change, if we want to boil it down to the essence, that becomes the new paradigm of impact investing.
Right. Peter and Dominic, thank you so much. This has been a rich conversation on systemic investing, and we got into all kinds of nodes and places, and I'm really excited about the possibilities here. So wish you all the best with the Systemic Investing Summit that's coming up, and really looking forward to perhaps doing a part 2 of this conversation very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinod.